Hello, everyone, and welcome to Good Thinking Live. This is the weekly show, streaming live on LinkedIn Live and on YouTube Live. You can tune in to LinkedIn or you can tune into YouTube at Becky Saltzman. Subscribe, smash that bell button, and be notified because we're here most Monday mornings, 9 a.m. Pacific Coast time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, everywhere else, to take a little bit of time away from all the time we spend on being told what to think, to give ourselves the luxury of embracing the time for improving how we think. And this is also going to be an office hours for any of the LinkedIn Learning good thinkers out there who have taken our courses on critical thinking and decision making and applied curiosity and ideation. So all of these courses, this will be a chance where we will pull a little bit out of each of these courses to delve into any of your questions and topics in a fun, interactive way. So as usual, if you are a regular good thinker, you know the drill. Let us know who you are and where you're from. And we're going to get started today because we're going to delve into this distinction between emotional and intellectual empathy. All right. And this little segment today is taken a page out of our new course, Developing a Critical Thinking Mindset, that launched a couple of weeks ago on LinkedIn. If you have taken that course or any of our other courses on critical thinking or decision making, let us know. Are you a LinkedIn learner? Are you a good thinker? Are you a regular good thinker? So I'm going to welcome people to the show. I'm going to bring in your comments. I'm not going to be able to bring in every comment, and the stream goes so fast that I might miss your comment. But what I will do after the live show is try to answer any and all of your questions. So I'm going to welcome Barkley from Washington, D.C. Barkley's here, and Barkley may be adding some moderation services to our Good Thinking show in the future. So this is great. I'm going to say hello. We have got, another good thinker on the show. We've got Raj, hello. Bethany, hello. We've got from Raleigh, North Carolina. Then we've got, from Myanmar, LinkedIn learner, so LinkedIn user. So sometimes your name appears and sometimes it just says LinkedIn user. So if you want to put your name in the chat and let us know your name and who you are, that's fantastic. Welcome. Oh, from the Philippines, one of my favorites. I've not been to Cebu, but I have been to some of the other islands. All right. Oh, from Mumbai, Raj from Mumbai, welcome. And this is the cool thing about this show is that we have people, good thinkers from all over the world. And that really makes it so much more interactive and fun. From the UAE, Mr. Deng, regular good thinker from Senegal. I love it. And we've got Jeffrey from Canada, new LinkedIn learner. Welcome to LinkedIn Learning. It's so fun and interactive. It can become a whole world for you. So I'm really glad to see all of you here. Okay, let's get going. I'm going to try to welcome more people as they come on the show. Be sure to participate and let's get started. Now, when people use the word empathy, and this is your first question for today. When people use the word empathy, we kind of use the word empathy to mean different things. We have this idea of what it means. And, we're probably right. Words have distinct meaning, but words are not, it's not like deep science that this word means this. So when you think of the word empathy, what comes to mind? How do you define it? All right. Welcome from India, Stephen. Welcome from the city with the airport, both Travel and Leisure and Forbes called the best large airport in the United States. For those of us finally, maybe one day we'll be back to traveling. Maybe you can visit this airport. Good one. I didn't know that. Always good trivia from Stephen. If you have trivia from where you are that you would like to share it in the stream and maybe we'll get to it. But if we don't get to it live, we'll get to it after the show. All right. Some people use empathy as kind of this umbrella term that covers compassion and kindness and altruism and all of these things. But we're going to narrow down the distinction because these distinctions are important when you look at empathy as a tool for good thinking or critical thinking, and particularly as a tool for decision making. All right, we're going to go like this. We're going to say Bangladesh and Norway and the UK. We have people from all over. So definitely we have got, let's see. Empathy is an approach is to approach the feeling of other people in a particular situation. I'm really glad that you said that, because that is that cues us up. So we've got, what do you think? So what do you think? With the word feeling, I want you to kind of glom onto this word feeling. Now, many of you who are new to good thinking know that when we can, we offer rubber chickens to participants. So all of you who have said who you are and where you're from, fantastic. We have got Thomas from DC. We've got a great good thinker from Northeast India. So we listen all over the world. So if you represent, you got to represent your country. Represent your country. Let us know who you are. All right. When we see someone in pain, it's one thing to understand that they're in pain, but some people actually can feel the pain of other people, literally feel the pain, take on that pain. Are any of you what we would call empaths, or emotionally empathetic to the point where you actually have felt the pain? Now, when it's our child or our best friend or a family member, we might feel it because of our connection. But what about actually feeling the pain from someone that, you don't even know? You don't even know. How many of you can feel that? I'm going to refer to that ability to feel what other people feel as emotional empathy, as distinct from intellectual empathy. And I think I mentioned this how many of you have taken our new course, Developing the Critical Thinking Mindset, Developing a Critical Thinking Mindset on LinkedIn Learning? So I think I talked about this because my mother used to always say when I would go skiing, and she'd say, oh, put on a jacket because I'm cold. She literally felt the chill from me. But here's the deal. I wasn't cold because I was skiing and I was like sweating. So sometimes emotional empathy, we might describe it as feeling what other people feel. But I think a better distinction is, or better definition is, feeling what you believe the other person is feeling. And that's a little cue. That's a little cue. Got someone from South Africa. Welcome from South Africa. All right. So this is a little cue. Intellectual empathy, by our definitions today, and we can tease this out during the show today, is understanding what others experience. So here is my question. Do you think, given these definitions, all right, do you think there is a downside to empathy? What do you think? Let us know. Do you think there's a downside to empathy? No downside to empathy. And, this is a perspective. These aren't right and wrong answers, but I want to try to convince you that to use empathy as a critical thinking or good thinking tool requires two things. One, really getting clear on what we're talking about when we're talking about empathy. We're not talking about compassion or sympathy, but we're talking about two different types of empathy, and really understanding the key word, feeling and understanding. Feeling, thinking we feel, and understanding, and thinking we understand. That's good too. So anyone think that there is a downside to empathy, put it in the chat. The second thing that gives you a little bit of a clue as in terms of the perspective that I come from is, the second thing to understand is that emotional empathy can be biased and irrational in ways that might make us more, or less rather, intellectually empathetic. And if intellectual empathy is understanding and emotional empathy is feeling, you have to make sure that what your goal is. Do you want to feel what other people feel, or think you feel what other people feel, or do you want to understand what other people feel? So then you have some traps to look out for. All right. So we have downside, but also good side. Bethany, absolutely. Rubber chickens. I totally agree. Totally agree. It makes you more intimate and more, and it could make you more compassionate. But when you're really trying to use empathy as a tool for making decisions or solving problems or really helping people, versus sometimes we do things because it helps ourselves feel better, then we need to understand. We've got LinkedIn users say yes. Aha. Okay. When you misunderstand people using empathy and they realize or perceive that you're trying to speculate your situation. Really good. Really good. Good point. And this is hard because you can be trying to help, thinking you're helping, and maybe you're not helping. So, hello. KSA in the house. All right. Yale psychologist Paul Bloom wrote a book called Against Empathy. And if you're really interested in this topic, I suggest you delve into Paul's book. He argues that empathy leads us astray when we rely on it to make moral decisions. Now, I would argue that that's a distinction between emotional empathy and intellectual empathy. And I think he makes a pretty solid case when you should look out for empathy leading you astray. So here are some problems with emotional empathy. We're going to say empathy is opening your perspective to those of others and allow yourself to experience their existence. And the question is, and that's a good point, but here's the question. I like that. Can you really understand someone else's perspective? And we're going to get into some of the traps. All right. Understanding is better for helping community. Absolutely. Understanding is probably better for maybe big decisions or strategic decisions, or actually making a concrete difference. But emotional empathy can have its positive sides, as you mentioned too, which I like. Okay. So we've got these two things. One of the reasons that emotional empathy can lead us astray is that it's bias. We have a bias for people who are like us. We can try to train ourselves out of that bias. But how many of you have children? I have grown children. My kids are in their 20s. So how many of you have children? Now, can you really train yourself to care more about another child, a neighborhood child or a friend's child, than your own child? I don't know. But, the closer we are to this group, so our family, our kids, our nationality, our religion, our community, our culture, the more we have empathy for people that are like us. So there is a bias that we have to acknowledge. Now, when you think about how much empathy you have for your own child, or how much you feel you understand your own child versus maybe understand your own country or your own nationality, you can see that there's a difference, right? Or your own children. There's a difference. So there's a scale. But there's this interesting study that was done in the United States where they asked liberals and conservatives to do some evaluating of trying to understand the other side. We always say the other side as if it's like two distinct sides, but whatever. So they asked liberals, a lot of academics in the United States tend to be more liberal. So they asked liberals, there's a lot more study about trying to understand conservatives. And the disparity actually in academia of things where you're trying to understand conservatives is way heavier than the same thing trying to understand liberals, because people who are conservative, they know they don't need to understand other conservatives because they just know conservatives are right. So they're going to be much more inclined to want to understand liberals or do research to understand liberals. And liberals, for the same reason, are going to try to do research to understand conservatives because they know that liberals are right. So that there's this interest in our own where it's kind of a default. We get this. We don't need to research this. We need to research about other people. So this is an interesting play on how this like-minded bias can sneak into things. We naturally empathize with people who are part of our circle. And maybe they look like us or share our ethnicity. So, but if you base your charitable giving on empathy, you might find yourself, number one, you might find yourself donating to people or helping people who are like you. Or number two, you might find yourself donating to other people who are like you donate or help. So there's kind of the one where you might help people that are more like you, or two, you might help people or help situations that other people like you tend to help, if that makes sense. All right. So we have got, let's see, are there any bystander or tests to subject them to the decision to decide whether you use empathy or not? Yes. Great question. We're going to get to that. Absolutely. Empathy is to try to be in the place of another. Absolutely. Can we? That's a good question. Mr. Dane, can we be in a place of another? Can we really do it? All right. The next problem to look out for is the problem of innumeracy. So that means that numbers can deceive us. Now you can check out Paul Slovik's work on this, and Paul Slovik was a professor at University of Oregon in Eugene, just down the I-5 from where I am in Portland. And so here's my question. We're going to get into really get into your head for just a second, because we're going to do some participate. Do you care about the mass suffering of others? Do you care about the mass suffering of others? And when you think about how you care, Do you care intellectually? Like you actually understand it and you intellectually care, or do you care emotionally? That's the question. Do you care? Because it turns out that it is really a lot harder to care about the mass suffering of others because numbers deceive us. All right. So you're like, what? How does this even apply? All right. When the number of victims in a tragedy increases, our empathy decreases. And that turns out to be both our intellectual empathy and our emotional empathy. Our net empathy decreases. So think about some of these numbers, all right? So think about some of these numbers, and you could tell me if you can do this, all right? So think about some of these numbers. Can you imagine 1 million people, all right? So imagine where you are, wherever you live, or maybe a park near you, or a neighborhood block, or whatever. Imagine 1 million people. How much space would they take up? Like I live across the street from a park. I'm looking at this park right now. I'm looking across the street. I see it right out my window here. I can't tell, would it fill up 2 of these size parks? Would it fill up half the park? Imagine 1 million people. Can you literally, not 900,000 people, not 2 million people, but 1 million people? Can you get 1 million people in your mind? Well, it turns out we really have a hard time with these large abstractions. And when we see one life, we can imagine their hopes and their pain. We can even feel and understand that there are maybe countless complexities in the narratives of that one life. We might simplify it a little too much from time to time, but we can understand if someone pushes us that each individual life has a lot of components and complexities, whether they look like us or not, that we can't necessarily understand. But what about 1 million? What about 82 million? There are 82 million displaced humans in the world right now. So that number it feels way too much of an abstraction. And those numbers can't convey the costs of a humanitarian crisis. And that's a devious mind trick at play. All right, so Bethany says, both. Okay, excellent. Back to a previous question. So I agree with that. And then empathy, Hussein says, empathy is when having the intellectual ability of listening to others without judging them. Okay, so I guess it depends on if you're using judgmental versus judgment. Because I think judgment is using our brains as a measuring tool. And a lot of times we have to judge. That doesn't mean that we're jumping to conclusions and being judgmental. So I think that that's probably the distinction you are making. All right, I care emotionally. Absolutely, we care emotionally. But if we learn a few tips and tricks, that's a really good point, Niraj. We learn a few tips and tricks, then we can start to improve our overall quality of empathy and therefore our understanding. All right, psychic numbing. So remember this term psychic numbing. How many of you know about psychic numbing? It means that as the number of victims in a tragedy increases, our intellectual empathy, thus our willingness to help, decreases. It reliably decreases. And this has even been found in studies when you make the story go from one person to 2 people. So in my personal life, I'm an ambassador for an organization called Shelter Box. It's a humanitarian organization. And we rely on donations to go out and help the most vulnerable people in the world. And there's some interesting information because when we make a story about one person, their story, donations are significantly higher than when we make a story about a whole refugee camp or a whole refugee crisis or a whole crisis or even a group or a family, for example. So it's very interesting how when we move from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to many, our ability to be empathetic decreases significantly. And that's one of the challenges with empathy. All right, there's the number of victims in a lot. We feel less powerful. We feel powerless. So we shut down these feelings of empathy and kind of try to focus our feelings. But that also makes us less intellectually empathetic. All right. And then let's see. Question. What if instead of saying a group of people, we highlighted people in a group? So instead of saying, okay, this is a group of people that really needs our help, we say these are the people in this group. Well, it turns out that that simple switch does have an effect on at least our emotional empathy, influencing our intellectual empathy in the right direction as measured by donations. All right, so that's a little switch. And there was an interesting study in Seattle where they were trying to get people who, they were trying to put in bike lanes and do all this legislation to encourage more people to ride bikes to reduce the traffic and pollution in Seattle. So they kept saying, we need all this legislation to allow cyclists to do this and allow cyclists. They weren't getting anywhere. And they made one simple switch. And I think this is an example of how you can make a little tweak when you're trying to understand individuals or groups of individuals. They made a little switch. Instead of calling the cyclists, they called the people on bikes and people in cars. So it was motorists and cyclists, this abstract group of, I don't like those motorists, or I don't like those cyclists. And then they changed it to people on bikes and people in cars. And that was the one fascinating thing that seemed to be a key differentiator in moving the legislation forward. All right, I've missed some of your comments. I'm so sorry, but we'll get to them after. I want to say, okay, so I brought this in another language you guys can interpret, but this is great. So the next thing, there's a third problem, is that empathy can be weaponized. So politicians can use our empathy for victims of certain crimes to motivate anger and to motivate anger and hatred toward marginalized groups. So there's a lot of examples of this. We see where maybe there's legislation in this country, in the United States, there's legislation on immigration. So a politician does not want this particular legislation to pass. So they say, okay, well, how can we vilify immigrants? So they find one person who has been allegedly or actually has been a victim of a crime that was perpetrated by an immigrant. And they highlight that fact that this person is an immigrant, or they highlight the fact that this person is of a particular, ideology or whatever. And then they show this one victim, and that is used for determining whether this legislation that doesn't have anything to do with any of this stuff should pass. And there's an interesting story. There was a kid that was like 11-month-old in the UK. And he had some rare fatal disease, and the United States, some of the senators of the United States had been contacted. Maybe they knew someone who knew someone who knew someone, and they were trying to bring this kid to the United States for medical treatment. And at the same time, a lot of effort. At the same time, some of those same senators were lobbying to kill legislation or to institute legislation that would eliminate healthcare for millions of Americans. And it's an abstraction. That's an abstraction. So they've got this one kid, maybe I think his name is like Charlie Gard. You can look up the back in maybe it was 2011. They were all into saving Charlie Gard. Meanwhile, also into legislating to remove healthcare for millions of people. So we know that these things exist, and we know actually that these abstractions exist in our heads, not just in our minds where we are aware of them, in our heads. So in an experiment known as the blame game, I think I talk about this in the course, Developing a Critical Thinking Mindset, subjects watched videos of people with AIDS that were struggling to cope with pain. So this was really more toward the height of the AIDS epidemic. And subjects were told that people either had contracted AIDS through blood transfusions or through intravenous drug use. All right. So the results revealed that the subjects were significantly more empathetic to the pain of transfusion patients. And this was seen not only in the subjects self-reporting, but also in their increased brain activity in areas associated with pain processing. So we know that there's something going on, even, behind what we can have access to, that could make emotional empathy manipulatable and lead us astray. All right. So what can we do? We got to get to it. We're going to try to be in and out in 30 minutes. I want to say hi to a few more people. Okay. Using 1% as misleading evidence. Is it a kind of logical fallacy? Yeah, it can be. Good point. Great point. Here I would go with intellectual empathy. And I think in decision making, whether you're making a moral decision or you're making a decision to a strategic decision, I would give a big plug for removing the misleading qualities of emotional empathy and lead to increase your ability or up your ability to be intellectually empathetic. Because if actually helping or making a wise decision strategically or whatever is what is your goal. Now, if your goal is to connect with someone, that's a totally different thing. But moral decisions or strategic decisions ideally, you should emphasize intellectual empathy. So what can you do? Here are a few things. You can beware of collective empathy. So when we witness a group working toward a seemingly shared goal, maybe it's a product launch at work or a protest in the streets, there is this bias called the false consensus bias, where we can think that every single person in that group shares the same motivations. So we see a protest in the streets, they're all carrying the same sign, they're wearing the same t-shirts, whatever. We can literally think that every single person there has the same motivation as the next person. And if we are a member of that group, if we're a member protesting and we look around, we could, or even a product launch at work, doesn't have to be something of controversy, we can think that everyone is similarly motivated, that they're like us. And then we allow our feelings, the feelings that we have, to be translated to feelings, put it on other people. And that can be extremely misleading. Labeling the group is a trick, just like, oh, this immigration policy, look at this bad immigrant who committed a crime against this individual person. So labeling groups can be a hint to watch out for being manipulated into emotional empathy when intellectual empathy, you should be leading with intellectual empathy. For example, the marketing department. The marketing department doesn't like this. The marketing department doesn't understand. Or these students, the student protesters don't understand. Or academia is this. Anytime you see a label, and you're trying to explain, or someone's trying to explain how this group of people think, ding, 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 that's a sign you might be being manipulated into emotional empathy when you need to shift into intellectual empathy. All right, number one, beware of assuming you know the reason for someone else's misfortune. We don't always know all the reasons. As a matter of fact, we never know all the reasons. We don't even necessarily know all the reasons for our own misfortunes, but certainly we don't know all the reasons for other people's misfortunes. So this is where that, experiment in the blame game, where you looked at AIDS patients and you were told that they contracted AIDS one way or the other way, and then you make moral judgments or moral decisions based on those feelings. So assuming we know makes us understand less. Assuming we know makes us understand less. So do you just give up on empathy? No. No. We do not give up on empathy. From a critical thinking standpoint, the key is to prioritize intellectual empathy in cases where you're trying to be making a strategic decision or a moral decision. Making a decision to help or to fix something or to make a difference, it is in that case better to be aware of when you might be leaning toward emotional empathy, when you've got to make sure that you're checking for biases so that you are able to actually make a more a cleaner, more hygienic, strategic or moral decision. So this is just acknowledging where emotional empathy has its deceiving and devious downsides. All right. So what does this mean? So what do you do? Well, this all will help you have target fixation. In other words, not be manipulated into seeing this one person as representative of a group and making a decision based on that, or getting over the abstractions. Now, sometimes helping one person means you're helping everyone, but beware, or helping many, I should say, helping many, but beware of when that's being manipulated. So that's really it. Anyone have any last minute comments? Can we have an example when we can see emotional empathy being used for personal gains and how we can switch? Personal gains, perfect example. I'll give you another example. Yes, okay, let's see what we've got. So how do you turn off emotional empathy? All right, this is good. Those are two things. All you have to do is acknowledge that there is a difference between emotional and intellectual empathy. Once you do that, now you know, okay, am I being tricked into false consensus bias? Am I being tricked into making a decision based on these people are like me, so I feel this way, therefore they must feel this way too? That's one of the big things. And also making sure that you are not being manipulated. The example that I used of a politician who looks at broader legislation and they're like, how can I get people against this legislation? Because this legislation, I feel that this legislation is really bad. I don't think it's a good immigration policy. So how do I vilify immigrants? I can't collectively vilify immigrants, but I can find one victim of someone who is an immigrant, and I can highlight that and highlight that and highlight that. You see politicians doing that all the time. Let me tell you about Joe the plumber. When you see a politician or someone trying to convince you of something by using an example of one person, that is a hint, ding, 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 that your emotional empathy is being manipulated to the expense of your intellectual empathy. All right. So that is really what we've got talking about today. Good thinking. I hope you guys tune in. We are going to be here. We have been here, and we're going to continue to be here almost every Monday, 9 a.m. Pacific time, 4 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, for all of you all scattered throughout, bringing good thinkers together who really want to spend just 30 minutes to give ourselves the luxury of improving how we think. If there are topics in the LinkedIn Learning courses, in our LinkedIn Learning courses, or in any topics in this good thinking area of critical thinking, how to see the world closer to how it really is. How do we know what's true? How do we evaluate information? Those are the key critical thinking questions in order to make better decisions. Anyone has any questions, you should be part of good thinking. And you can go to Applied Curiosity Lab and download the Good Thinking Manifesto for free. So definitely go there. We're going to have a lot of new things on the site. So anyway, join us each Monday, 9 a.m. LinkedIn Live rather, and YouTube Live. Thank you, and have a great rest of your week. Thanks for participating, all you good thinkers.